Deliveries are around back near the hangars. This lounge is for members only.
Jessica Palmer's voice cut through the Aurora Elite private terminal like a blade wrapped in silk. The 28-year-old concierge didn't even look up from her computer screen as she delivered the dismissal, her perfectly manicured fingers continuing to type with the rhythm of someone who had perfected the art of professional rudeness. The woman standing at the marble check-in counter didn't move. Rain dripped from her oversized gray hoodie onto the pristine floor, creating small dark circles on the Italian stone. Her worn jeans were frayed at the knees, and her white sneakers had seen better days. She carried a battered black carry-on that looked like it had survived multiple wars. "I'm not making a delivery," the woman said quietly. Her voice was calm, measured. "I'm checking in for flight AE 447 to London." Jessica's fingers paused. She glanced up, her blue eyes scanning the woman's appearance with the precision of a security scanner. The hoodie was 2 sizes too big. The backpack slung over one shoulder was canvas, not leather. No visible jewelry. No designer labels. No obvious markers of wealth. Around them, the Aurora Elite Lounge hummed with the quiet conversations of the ultra-wealthy. Men in $5,000 suits discussed merger deals over $17 espressos. Women, dripping in Cartier jewelry, planned charity galas while sipping champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was a sanctuary for the 0.001%, where membership fees started at $500,000 annually. The woman at the counter looked like she'd wandered in from the wrong terminal. "Ma'am?" Jessica said, her tone growing sharper. "This is a private facility. Aurora Elite serves exclusively high-net-worth individuals. Perhaps you're looking for the main terminal. It's about a 10-minute walk that way." She gestured vaguely toward the exit, not bothering to hide her impatience. Behind the woman, other passengers were beginning to stare. An elderly man in a navy suit whispered something to his wife. A younger woman in designer athleisure pulled out her phone, probably to document what she assumed was about to become an embarrassing situation. The woman in the hoodie reached into her pocket slowly, deliberately. She pulled out something small and black, sliding it across the marble counter with a soft clink that somehow managed to silence the conversations around them. Jessica stared at the object. It was a card, but unlike any she'd seen before. Matte, black titanium, so dark it seemed to absorb light. No visible numbers or text, just a small Aurora Elite logo etched in what appeared to be actual platinum. "Amara Williams," the woman said simply. "I believe I'm on your manifest." Jessica's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the card. She'd heard whispers about these cards. The Aurora Obsidian. Only 12 existed worldwide. They weren't just membership cards, they represented equity-level investment in Aurora Elite Aviation. Ownership stakes that started at 9 figures. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the name with a precision born of sudden panic. The screen flashed green, then filled with information that made Jessica's carefully applied makeup feel like it was melting off her face. Amara Williams, priority owner, class board member, Aurora Elite, aviation equity stake 67%, special instructions, full discretion, no exceptions. The woman Amara was the primary owner of Aurora Elite Aviation. Not just a passenger, not just a member. The owner, Miss Williams. Jessica stammered, her professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. I apologize. The system didn't. We weren't expecting you to." She paused, realizing she was about to say something even worse. To look so comfortable, Amara finished, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's a long flight. I dress for comfort, not performance." Around them, the other passengers had gone silent. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could sense the shift in power dynamics. The woman they'd been ready to mock was now being treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. "Your usual Suite 1A is prepared and waiting." Jessica continued, her voice now honey sweet. "Full privacy configuration. Would you like our ground service to handle your luggage?" Amara glanced down at her single battered carry-on. "I think I can manage." She took the boarding pass that Jessica offered with hands that shook slightly. As Amara turned to walk toward the security checkpoint, Jessica called out, "Miss Williams, is there anything specific you need for the flight? Any special arrangements?" Amara paused, looking back over her shoulder. Just what everyone else needs Jessica. Basic respect. It shouldn't require a card to earn that. The words weren't harsh, but they landed with the weight of a verdict. Around the lounge, conversations resumed in hushed tones. Phone cameras that had been ready to capture embarrassment were quietly put away. Amara walked toward security, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor. She'd learned long ago that assumptions were the cheapest thing people could make, and often the most expensive thing they'd pay for. Behind her, Jessica stared at the obsidian card still in her trembling hands, realizing she'd just failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. The woman in the hoodie disappeared through the security checkpoint, leaving behind a lounge full of people who suddenly understood they'd witnessed something significant. They just didn't know yet how significant it would become. Amara Williams owned the sky they were about to fly through. She just didn't look like their idea of someone who should. The Aurora Elite aircraft sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its modified Boeing 787 Dreamliner hull gleaming despite the gray London morning. This wasn't just transportation, it was a flying palace. Only 30 seats filled the massive cabin, each one a private suite with a closing door, a lie-flat bed, and enough space for a small office. Amara climbed the air stairs slowly, her battered carry-on bumping against her hip with each step. The humidity from the rain made her hoodie cling uncomfortably to her shoulders, but she'd learned that comfort came in many forms. Sometimes it was Egyptian cotton sheets. Sometimes it was the knowledge that you could dress however you wanted when you owned the plane. "Good morning. Welcome aboard Aurora Elite Flight AE 447, came a warm voice from the cabin door. Sophia Martinez, the lead flight attendant, stood with the kind of smile that had been perfected through years of customer service training. She was 26 with kind brown eyes and the sort of competent energy that made passengers feel safe at 38,000 feet. Sophia's smile faltered slightly as she took in Amara's appearance. The hoodie, the jeans with frayed knees, the sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her training kicked in immediately. Customer service protocols demanded courtesy regardless of appearance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sophia asked, her tone remaining professional despite her confusion. Amara handed over the slip of paper. Sophia scanned it quickly. Seat 1, a priority class pre-board status. Everything appeared to be in order, but it didn't make sense. Seat 1A was Aurora Elite's premium suite located right behind the cockpit divider. It was typically reserved for heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, or A-list celebrities who valued privacy above all else. The woman in front of her looked like she'd be more comfortable in a coffee shop than a private jet. "Right this way, miss." Sophia glanced at the boarding pass again. "Miss Williams, 1A is just up front." They walked through the cabin, passing other passengers who were settling into their suites. A man in a crisp navy suit looked up from his Financial Times, his eyes following Amara with undisguised curiosity. Two women in designer dresses paused their conversation about an upcoming charity auction to stare. An older gentleman with silver hair and an expensive watch whispered something to his companion that made them both glance in Amara's direction. Amara was used to the stares. In boardrooms, at investment conferences, and first-class lounges around the world, she'd learned that her appearance often preceded her reputation. It used to bother her. Now, it was simply information. "Here we are," Sophia said, gesturing to Suite 1A. "You're home for the next 8 hours. Can I get you anything to start? Champagne coffee, please?" "Black." Amara slid into the leather seat and immediately pulled out her laptop. "And Sophia, thank you for being professional." The comment caught Sophia off guard. "Of course, Miss Williams. That's what we're here for." But as Sophia walked back to the galley, she couldn't help but notice the whispered conversations that followed in Amara's wake. The other passengers were clearly confused, some even annoyed. She caught fragments of hushed discussions, probably using miles or points. Maybe she won a contest. Doesn't look like she belongs in first class, let alone a private jet. Sophia found her colleague Maria Santos preparing coffee in the galley. Maria was in her 40s, a veteran flight attendant who'd worked for Aurora Elite since its inception 5 years ago. "What's the story with one?" Maria asked, quietly nodding toward Amara's suite. "I'm not sure," Sophia admitted. Her boarding pass checks out, but she trailed off, not wanting to voice what they were both thinking. "But she looks like she couldn't afford a commercial airline ticket, let alone this," Maria finished. "Trust me, I've seen it before. Rich parents buying their kids' friends' tickets, celebrities giving away seats to their assistants. She's probably someone's charity case." Sophia felt uncomfortable with the conversation, but couldn't deny her own curiosity. Aurora Elite passengers typically arrived in luxury cars, wore clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and carried themselves with the unmistakable confidence of the truly wealthy. Amara Williams was typing quietly on a laptop that looked like it was held together with hope and determination. Meanwhile, in Suite 1, Amara was deep in concentration reviewing financial documents for her latest acquisition. Her logistics software company Quantum Flow had revolutionized supply chain management for major corporations worldwide. 2 years ago, she'd sold it to Amazon for $4.2 billion, making her one of the youngest billionaires in tech. With part of those proceeds, she'd quietly purchased Aurora Elite Aviation, seeing it as both a smart investment and a way to ensure that private aviation maintained certain standards of service and dignity. Standards that, based on the whispers and stares, weren't being universally applied. She pulled off her headphones as she noticed a commotion near the cockpit. The aircraft door was still open and she could hear voices discussing seating arrangements. One voice in particular was growing louder, authoritative, impatient. Through the gap in her suite door, she watched as a man in a captain's uniform emerged from the cockpit. Captain David Reynolds was 48 years old, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from 2 decades of flying. He carried himself like someone who was used to being the ultimate authority in any room or aircraft he entered. Reynolds was speaking in low, urgent tones, with Sophia gesturing toward the passenger manifest in her hands. Amara couldn't make out the words, but she could read body language well enough. Something was about to happen. She saved her work and closed the laptop, settling back in her seat. In her experience, when powerful men started having urgent, whispered conversations about seating arrangements, it usually meant someone was about to get moved. Given the stares and whispers she'd been receiving since boarding, Amara had a pretty good idea who that someone might be. She took a sip of her coffee and waited. She'd been underestimated before. She'd been asked to move before. She'd been told she didn't belong before. But she'd never been asked to move from her own plane. This was going to be interesting. Outside, the London rain continued to fall on the tarmac, and the last few passengers hurried up the air stairs. The aircraft door would close soon, and flight AE 447 would push back from the gate. But first, Captain Reynolds had a problem to solve. He just didn't realize yet that his solution was about to create a much bigger problem than he could possibly imagine. Amara's coffee grew cold as she watched a young black girl, maybe 8 years old, walking through the terminal with her parents. The family was dressed nicely, Sunday clothes her grandmother would have called them, but they still drew stares from other travelers as they made their way toward the gate area. A security guard stepped into their path asking to see boarding passes, with a tone that suggested he doubted their legitimacy. The father handed over the documents with practiced patience, the kind that came from a lifetime of having your presence questioned in spaces where others belonged without explanation. The sight triggered something deep in Amara's memory, pulling her back 16 years to a different airport, a different time. She was 16, then standing in Detroit Metropolitan Airport with a worn duffel bag and a scholarship letter to MIT folded carefully in her jacket pocket. The letter represented everything her escape from poverty, her path to a future her grandmother had only dreamed of, proof that her mind could take her places her circumstances never could. Young Amara had arrived 4 hours early for her flight to Boston. It was her first time flying and she didn't want to miss anything. The scholarship covered tuition and room and board, But the ticket to start her new life had taken every dollar her grandmother could scrape together from cleaning houses and working double shifts at the diner. She'd researched the airport online, studied the terminal maps, and learned about the different lounges and amenities. The Platinum Club Lounge had caught her attention, a quiet space where she could study and wait for her flight without the chaos of the main terminal. The lounge had been almost empty when she'd walked in, the laptop bag over her shoulder, wearing her best jeans and a Detroit Lions hoodie her grandmother had bought her for her birthday. She'd found a corner table, pulled out her advanced calculus textbook, and settled in to review her coursework. She'd been there for 20 minutes when the security guard appeared. "Excuse me, miss." The man was older white, with the kind of authority that came from years of being told he was in charge of keeping certain people out of certain places. "This lounge is for Platinum members only." Young Amara had looked up from her calculus problems, confused. "I know. I paid the day rate. $40. She'd shown him the receipt, proud that she'd managed to afford what felt like a luxury. The guard had barely glanced at the paper. "Day rates are for business travelers. Students can use the main terminal." "But I paid the fee," she'd insisted, her voice quiet but firm. "The website says anyone can pay the day rate." "Look, sweetie," the guard had said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality reserved for people he considered beneath his concern. "This isn't the place for people like you. The main terminal has plenty of seating. Food court's nice too. People like you." The words had hit her like a physical blow. She'd looked around the lounge at the businessmen in expensive suits, the women with designer handbags, the casual wealth that surrounded her, and realized that her $40 and her receipt meant nothing compared to how she looked. "I'd like to speak to a manager," 16-year-old Amara had said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The guard had laughed. "Sweetie, the manager's going to tell you the same thing. This isn't for you." So she'd gathered her books, folded her receipt carefully into her wallet, and walked out. But instead of going to the main terminal, she'd sat down on the floor just outside the lounge, pulled out her laptop, a refurbished machine her grandmother had bought from a pawn shop, and continued studying. She'd coded there for 3 hours, sitting cross-legged on the airport carpet, building a logistics tracking system for a computer science assignment. Other travelers stepped around her, some dropping change in front of her as if she were homeless. She'd ignored them all, focused only on the screen and the promise of the future she was building, one line of code at a time. When her grandmother had called to wish her luck before the flight, Amara had told her about the lounge incident. She'd expected comfort, maybe anger, on her behalf. Instead, her grandmother had laughed, not mockingly, but with the wisdom of someone who'd spent 70 years navigating a world that consistently underestimated her. "Baby," her grandmother had said, "they can't stop your mind from flying. Let them think they know who belongs where. While they're busy making assumptions, you'll be busy making history." That conversation had planted a seed. Sitting on the airport floor, surrounded by the judgment and dismissal of strangers, Amara had made a silent promise to herself. One day, she would own the spaces that had rejected her. One day, she would ensure that no one else would have to prove their worth with a receipt and a boarding pass. One day, she would make sure that respect wasn't something you had to earn. It would be something everyone received simply by virtue of being human. The plane to Boston had been delayed by 2 hours. She'd spent the time in the main terminal coding and dreaming, building the foundation of what would eventually become quantum flow. Every line of code was written with purpose, every algorithm designed with the memory of sitting on that airport floor. When she'd finally boarded the plane to start her new life, she'd looked back at the lounge one last time. The security guard was still there, keeping people like her out of spaces they'd paid to access. She'd wondered then if he had any idea that the girl he'd dismissed would one day own the entire airport. Now, sitting in her own aircraft 16 years later, Amara realized that people hadn't changed much. They still made assumptions. They still decided who belonged where based on appearance rather than substance. The difference was that now she had the power to do something about it. She opened her laptop again, but instead of returning to her work, she pulled up Aurora Elite's employee handbook and training protocols. If what she suspected was about to happen actually happened, there would be changes made. Immediate changes. People like you, the guard, had said all those years ago. He'd been right in a way. She was exactly like the 16-year-old girl who'd sat on the airport floor coding her way to a different future. She just hadn't lost her ability to fly. The aircraft shuddered slightly as ground crew disconnected the external power, and Captain Reynolds checked his watch with visible irritation. They were already 15 minutes behind schedule, and the delay was about to get worse. Through the cockpit windows, he watched a black luxury sedan pull up to the aircraft stairs. Aurora Elite's ground crew immediately sprang into action, unfurling a red carpet and opening umbrellas to shield the late arrival from the persistent London drizzle. Senator Bradley Thompson emerged from the vehicle like a man accustomed to making entrances. At 52, he carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who'd spent 3 decades in Washington politics. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the weather, his navy overcoat was clearly bespoke, and he moved with the unhurried pace of someone who expected the world to wait for him. Behind him came his aide, a nervous young man clutching a tablet and phone, probably managing the crisis that had caused their late arrival. Thompson's private jet had suffered a mechanical failure, forcing him to seek alternative transportation to London for a critical NATO subcommittee meeting. Captain Reynolds straightened his tie and stepped out of the cockpit to greet the distinguished passenger. He'd flown Senator Thompson twice before, and both flights had resulted in glowing reviews sent directly to Aurora Elite's board of directors. Thompson was exactly the kind of passenger Reynolds respected. Powerful, connected, and unafraid to show his appreciation for exceptional service. Senator Thompson Reynolds said, extending his hand as the politician boarded, "Welcome aboard. I'm Captain Reynolds. I believe we've flown together before." "Indeed, we have," Captain Thompson replied, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who made his living convincing people to trust him. "I trust you can make up some time in the air. I have a rather important meeting that I cannot miss." "Absolutely, sir. I've already filed for priority routing. We'll have you on the ground in London with time to spare." Thompson nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Now I trust my usual seat is available, 1A, if memory serves. He gets motion sickness if he's not in the bulkhead position." Reynolds felt his stomach tighten. He glanced toward the front of the cabin where Amara sat in Suite 1A, her hoodie-covered head visible through the gaps in the privacy partition. The woman, who clearly didn't belong in premium accommodations, occupying the seat that rightfully belonged to a United States senator. "There's a slight logistical challenge with that particular seat," Senator Reynolds said carefully, "but I'm certain we can resolve it quickly." Thompson's eyebrows rose. "A challenge I specifically requested, 1A, when my office called to arrange this booking. Surely Aurora Elite can accommodate a simple seating preference." Sophia Martinez approached with a tablet in her hands, having overheard the conversation. "Captain Seat 1A is currently occupied by Miss Williams." She checked in this morning, and Williams Thompson interrupted his political mind, immediately cataloging connections. "Not Nancy Williams from the Transportation Committee. I didn't realize she was traveling today." "No," Sir Sophia replied, glancing nervously at Reynolds. "The passenger is Amara Williams." Thompson's expression shifted to polite confusion. "I'm afraid I don't know that name." "Some sort of celebrity, perhaps an influencer." Reynolds seized the opening. "Not exactly senator. She's—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She appears to be traveling on a complimentary arrangement. Possibly someone's guest or assistant." It wasn't entirely a lie, Reynolds reasoned. The woman in 1A certainly looked like someone who was flying as someone else's charity case rather than on her own merit. "I see Thompson," said his tone cooling several degrees, "and this person is refusing to accommodate a sitting United States senator." "She hasn't been asked yet," Reynolds admitted. "But given the circumstances, I thought it would be more appropriate if I handled the situation personally." Sophia shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, according to our records, Miss Williams has priority booking status." Her reservation was confirmed this morning, and Sophia Reynolds interrupted his voice, taking on the authoritative tone he used when his decisions were being questioned. Sometimes the computer doesn't tell the whole story. Senator Thompson is a valued Aurora Elite customer with specific medical needs. I'm certain Miss Williams will understand the situation once it's explained properly. Sophia wanted to protest further, but she'd learned long ago that questioning the captain's judgment in front of passengers was a career-limiting move. Still, something felt wrong about the entire situation. The woman in 1A had been nothing but polite and professional. Her boarding credentials were legitimate, and their training specifically emphasized that seating assignments were first come, first served, regardless of passenger status. But Senator Thompson was watching the exchange with growing impatience, and Captain Reynolds clearly expected compliance with his plan. "How would you like me to handle this?" Captain Sophia asked quietly. "I'll speak with her myself," Reynolds decided. "This requires a delicate touch. Senator, if you'd like to wait in the lounge area, I'll have this resolved in just a moment." Thompson nodded approvingly. "I appreciate your professionalism, Captain. This is exactly why I prefer Aurora Elite over other carriers." As Thompson moved toward the rear of the cabin with his aide, Reynolds took a deep breath and walked toward Suite 1A. He'd handled difficult passengers before, entitled celebrities who made unreasonable demands, business executives who thought their net worth entitled them to special treatment, politicians who expected the rules to bend around their schedules. But this situation was different. This wasn't about managing an unreasonable demand. This was about correcting an obvious mistake. The woman in 1A simply didn't belong there, and everyone on the aircraft knew it. He knocked gently on the frame of Suite 1A. Through the gap in the privacy screen, he could see Amara still working on her laptop noise-canceling headphones covering her ears. She looked up, pulling off the headphones with the slightly startled expression of someone who'd been deep in concentration. "Miss Williams," I presume Reynolds said, activating his most professional captain's voice. "I'm Captain Reynolds. Might I have a word?" Amara closed her laptop and gave him her full attention. "Of course, Captain. Is everything all right?" "Well, we have a slight situation." Reynolds began settling into the practiced tone he used when delivering bad news. "We've had a late addition to our passenger manifest, a distinguished gentleman with some specific medical requirements. He suffers from severe motion sickness and needs to be seated in the bulkhead position for health reasons." Amara's expression remained neutral, but Reynolds noticed her eyes sharpen slightly. "I see. And you're asking if I'd be willing to move to accommodate this passenger? I realize it's an inconvenience," Reynolds continued, "but I'm certain we can find you a comfortable alternative. Perhaps 4A. It's still a premium suite with full amenities." Captain Reynolds. Amara said slowly, her voice remaining calm, "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" The question caught him off guard. There was something in her tone, not threat, but a kind of quiet warning that made him pause. "I'm sorry, Miss Williams, but I don't understand your concern. We're simply trying to accommodate a passenger with medical needs." Amara set her laptop aside and looked directly into his eyes. "Because once I stand up and move, you're not going to like how this lands." Reynolds felt a flash of irritation. He'd been polite, professional, and accommodating. The last thing he needed was attitude from someone who was clearly flying above her station. "Miss Williams," he said, his tone becoming firmer, "I am the captain of this aircraft. My word is law at 38,000 feet, and right now I'm asking you to be reasonable about a simple seat change." Amara stood slowly gathering her laptop and the small backpack she'd stowed beside her chair. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that hadn't been there moments before, "you're about to learn the difference between rank and ownership." She stepped into the aisle, facing him directly. Around them, other passengers had begun to notice the confrontation. Phone cameras discreetly appeared and conversations quieted as people sensed drama developing. "Some people fly planes." Amara continued, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I own them." Reynolds laughed, actually laughed, a sound that echoed through the now silent aircraft. "Miss Williams, I appreciate your sense of humor, but we really do need to resolve this seating situation." "We do indeed," Amara agreed. "But not the way you think." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a contact labeled Aurora Elite Operations. Emergency line. "What are you doing?" Reynolds asked, his confidence beginning to waver as he noticed the complete silence in the cabin around them. Amara looked up from her phone, and for the first time since he'd approached her, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Captain Reynolds," she said, "I'm about to make a phone call that's going to change your life." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly Reynolds realized that something had gone very, very wrong with what should have been a simple seat reassignment. He just wasn't sure what. The silence in the cabin was absolute. 30 of the world's wealthiest individuals held their breath as Amara Williams stood in the aisle of her own aircraft, phone in hand, facing down a captain who had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Senator Thompson, who had been settling into a seat in the rear section, stood up to get a better view of the confrontation. His political instincts, honed by decades in Washington, told him this was about to become something significant. "Miss Williams," Captain Reynolds said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm going to need you to put that phone away and take your new seat. You're disrupting this flight." "No," Captain Amara replied, her thumb hovering over the call button, "you're ending your career." Miguel Rodriguez, a tech entrepreneur sitting in Suite 3B, discreetly activated his phone's video recording function. At 35, he'd built and sold 2 startups and had developed a keen sense for when he was witnessing something that would later prove historically significant. His Instagram live stream went active with zero fanfare. "This is Miguel Rodriguez, flying Aurora Elite to London," he whispered to his camera. "Y'all, I think I'm about to witness something incredible. A pilot just tried to remove a black woman from first class, and she's not backing down." 2 rows behind him, Lauren Patterson, a 29-year-old social media influencer with 800,000 TikTok followers, was having the same instinct. She started her own live stream, angling her phone to capture the standoff without being obvious about it. "Hey, beautiful people," she whispered to her audience. "We're about to take off for London, but there's some serious drama happening right now. A captain is trying to force a woman to give up her seat, and honestly, the vibes are not good." The viewer count on both streams began climbing rapidly. Word was spreading through social media's interconnected web that something was happening on a luxury flight, and people were tuning in to watch. Captain Reynolds, unaware that his confrontation was being broadcast to thousands of viewers, pressed forward. "Miss Williams, I'm trying to be reasonable here. We have a distinguished passenger with medical needs." And Captain Amara interrupted, her voice cutting through his explanation like a blade. "Let me ask you something. When you look at me, what do you see?" The question hung in the air. Reynolds glanced around the cabin, suddenly aware that every passenger was watching him. The weight of their attention pressed down on him like a physical force. "I see a passenger who's being unreasonable about a simple request," he replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You see a black woman in a hoodie who you assume doesn't belong in this seat," Amara said. It wasn't a question. "You see someone you can move around like furniture because you've decided that my appearance determines my worth." Sophia Martinez, who had been watching from the galley, felt her stomach clench. The passenger was right. That's exactly how this looked. How it was. James Brooks, an investment banker sitting in 2A, found himself leaning forward to listen more carefully. At 44, he'd seen plenty of discrimination in corporate America, but it was usually more subtle than this. More polite, more deniable. Miss Williams Reynolds said, his professional training warring with his growing frustration, "This is not about your race or your appearance. This is about accommodating a passenger with special needs. A passenger who arrived after me, booked his ticket after me, and somehow deserves my seat more than I do," Amara asked. "What makes him more special? Captain, his title, his skin color, his gender?" The questions hit like physical blows. Around the cabin, passengers shifted uncomfortably as they were forced to confront the reality of what they were witnessing. Senator Thompson, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond a simple seat dispute, tried to intervene. "Perhaps I could take a different seat," he called out. "I don't want to cause a disruption. How generous, Amara replied without taking her eyes off Reynolds. But this isn't about you anymore, Senator. This is about a captain who thinks he can remove passengers based on his personal assessment of who belongs where. Miguel's live stream viewer count had hit 10,000 and was climbing fast. Comments were flooding in. This is discrimination in real time. That pilot is about to learn a lesson. She's got such grace under pressure. Someone better record this because this is about to go viral. Lauren's TikTok stream was also gaining momentum with viewers sharing and resharing the live feed across multiple platforms. The hashtag Aurora Elite discrimination was already starting to trend. Captain Reynolds Amara continued, her voice maintaining its calm authority. I want you to think very carefully about your next words, because this conversation is being recorded by multiple passengers, live streamed to thousands of viewers, and documented in ways you haven't even considered. Reynolds felt sweat beginning to form at the back of his neck. He glanced around the cabin and noticed for the first time the phones that were discreetly pointed in his direction. The passengers who were leaning forward with the intensity of people watching history unfold. This is my aircraft, he said, falling back on the one authority he knew he possessed. My word is final here. Your aircraft, Amara repeated, and now there was something different in her voice. Something that made the hair on the back of Reynolds' neck stand up. Captain, you're about to discover that some assumptions are more expensive than others. She lifted her phone and with deliberate slowness pressed the call button. The sound echoed through the cabin's silence like a gunshot. The phone rang once, twice. Aurora Elite Operations, this is emergency command. How can we assist? Amara put the call on speaker and her voice carried clearly through the cabin. This is Amara Williams, board member of Aurora Elite Aviation. I need you to patch me through to the chairman immediately, Miss Williams. Yes, ma'am? Please hold while I connect you. The hold music that filled the cabin was classical, something peaceful and elegant that stood in stark contrast to the tension crackling through the air like electricity. Reynolds stared at the phone in Amara's hand, his mind racing. Board member, the woman in the hoodie was claiming to be on Aurora Elite's board of directors. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged glances. The live streams were now being shared across multiple social media platforms. Miguel's Instagram viewer count had hit 25,000. Lauren's TikTok was being screen recorded and shared to Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook. The hold music stopped. Amara. The voice that came through the speaker was warm, familiar, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone at the top of the corporate hierarchy. This is unexpected. What's happening? Hello, Charles, Amara replied, and Reynolds felt his world begin to tilt off its axis. She was talking to Charles Morrison, the chairman and CEO of Aurora Elite Aviation, like they were old friends. I'm on flight AE 447, and we have a situation that requires immediate board-level intervention. Are you safe? Morrison's voice immediately shifted to concern. I'm safe, Amara confirmed, but Captain Reynolds has just attempted to remove me from my seat to accommodate another passenger. When I declined to move, he invoked his authority as captain and demanded compliance. The silence from the phone was deafening. Captain Reynolds removed you from your seat. Morrison's voice had gone very, very quiet. Attempted to. Amara corrected. The removal order is still pending my compliance. Reynolds felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. The way Morrison had responded to Amara's name, the familiarity in their conversation, the immediate escalation to board-level concern, this wasn't a passenger complaint. This was something much worse. Captain Reynolds Morrison's voice came through the speaker addressing him directly. Are you listening to this conversation? Reynolds cleared his throat, his mouth suddenly dry. Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison, I can explain. Captain Morrison interrupted. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The cabin was so quiet that the sound of Reynolds' own heartbeat seemed loud in his ears. Yes, sir, the woman you just tried to remove from her seat owns 67% of Aurora Elite Aviation. She is the primary shareholder board chair and the reason you have a job. The words hit Reynolds like a physical blow. Around the cabin, audible gasps arose from passengers who were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. You just asked the owner of this airline to give up her seat. Reynolds looked at Amara, who was watching him with the expression of someone waiting for reality to catch up with perception. "Captain Reynolds," she said quietly, "welcome to the consequences of your assumptions." The weight of revelation settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, but for Amara, the moment felt strangely familiar. She'd been underestimated before, dismissed before, told she didn't belong before. Each time had been a lesson, and each lesson had made her stronger. Senator Thompson's comment echoed in her mind, "knowing your place." The words triggered a memory from 6 years ago, a moment that had crystallized her determination to build something that could never be taken away from her. She was 28 then, standing in the marble-lined conference room of Meridian Capital, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms. Her logistics software company, QuantumFlow, was generating $20 million in annual revenue and growing by 300% year over year. She'd come to Meridian, seeking Series B funding to expand internationally. The presentation had gone perfectly. Her pitch deck was flawless, her financial projections conservative, her technology revolutionary. QuantumFlow had already streamlined supply chains for Fortune 500 companies, saving them millions in efficiency gains while reducing carbon emissions by optimizing delivery routes. She'd worn her best suit at Charcoal Armani that had cost her a month's salary but seemed necessary for the occasion. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, her makeup professionally applied. She'd prepared for weeks, anticipating every possible question about market penetration, competitive advantages, and scalability. The room had been filled with partners of Meridian Capital, 12 men in expensive suits who sat around a conference table that probably cost more than most people's cars. At the head of the table sat Richard Blackstone, the firm's managing partner, a man whose name appeared on Forbes lists and whose opinion could make or break Silicon Valley careers. Miss Williams Blackstone had said after her presentation concluded, "This is certainly impressive work. QuantumFlow shows remarkable promise." She'd waited for the but that she could hear coming in his tone. "But we have some concerns about the leadership structure moving forward." "I'm sorry, I don't understand," she'd replied, though she was beginning to suspect she understood perfectly. "Well," another partner had interjected, "QuantumFlow is poised for explosive growth. We're talking about scaling from a $20 million startup to a potential billion-dollar enterprise. That requires a certain level of executive experience. I've grown the company from 0 to 20 million in 3 years," Amara had pointed out. "I've managed every stage of growth so far." Of course, Blackstone had agreed, and that's commendable. But Series B funding means preparing for IPO readiness, managing institutional investors, interfacing with Fortune 100 C-suites. Are you certain you're the right person to handle that level of complexity? The question had hung in the air like an accusation disguised as concern. "Are you asking if I'm capable of running my own company?" she'd asked. "We're asking if you've considered bringing in a more experienced CEO," another partner had said. "Someone with a proven track record of scaling tech companies. You could remain as CTO, focus on the technical aspects where you clearly excel. The technical aspects, where she clearly excelled. As if the business strategy, the market analysis, the financial projections she'd just presented had been someone else's work. "I see," she'd said quietly. "And do you have someone in mind for this CEO position?" "Actually, we do," Blackstone had replied, clearly relieved that she was being reasonable about their suggestion. "Marcus Patterson. He successfully scaled 3 previous startups to IPO, Harvard MBA, extensive Fortune 500 experience. He'd be perfect to guide QuantumFlow through its next phase. Marcus Patterson, white, male, connected. Everything she apparently wasn't. And what makes you think Marcus Patterson understands my industry better than I do?" she'd asked. "It's not about understanding the industry," one of the younger partners had explained as if speaking to a child. "It's about understanding how to navigate growth at scale. The relationships the network affects the executive presence required for billion-dollar valuations." Executive presence. The phrase had hit her like a slap. "Are you telling me that you'll fund my company only if I give up control of it?" she'd asked. "We're suggesting that you consider what's best for QuantumFlow's future," Blackstone had replied. "Your technical skills are undeniable, but scaling requires different competencies." She'd looked around the room at 12 men who'd never built anything from scratch, never written a line of code, never worked 100-hour weeks to keep a startup alive. Men who managed other people's money and called it expertise. "Gentlemen," she'd said, standing slowly from her chair, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She'd gathered her presentation materials with deliberate care, sliding each document back into her portfolio. "I didn't come here seeking permission to run my company. I came here offering you the opportunity to invest in it. Those are very different things." Miss Williams Blackstone had said, his tone taking on a patronizing quality. "You're being emotional about this. Business decisions shouldn't be personal." She'd paused at the door, looking back at the room, full of men who thought they knew what was best for her company. "You're right, Mr. Blackstone. Business decisions shouldn't be personal. So, here's my business decision. Quantum Flow will succeed without your money and without your conditions." She'd walked out of Meridian Capital with her dignity intact and her determination crystallized. 6 months later, she'd secured funding from a consortium of international investors who believed in her vision and her leadership. 2 years after that, she'd sold Quantum Flow to Amazon for $4.2 billion. Marcus Patterson, the man Meridian Capital had wanted to install as CEO, was still running his third startup, which had failed to reach profitability after 4 years. Richard Blackstone had reached out to her after the Amazon acquisition, congratulating her on her success and hinting that Meridian would be interested in funding her next venture. She'd never returned his call. The memory crystallized in her mind as she stood in the aisle of her own aircraft, watching Captain Reynolds process the reality of what he'd done. The same assumptions, the same casual dismissal, the same certainty that someone else was better qualified to be where she was. But this time was different. This time she owned the plane. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice cutting through his shock, "you just made the same mistake that 12 venture capitalists made 6 years ago. You assumed that how I look determines what I'm capable of." She could see understanding dawning in his eyes, not just of who she was, but of how completely he'd misread the situation. "Those venture capitalists offered to fund my company if I stepped aside and let a white man run it," she continued. "I walked away from their money and built it anyway. You just tried to move me out of my seat to accommodate someone you thought was more important." Around the cabin, passengers were recording every word, live streaming the moment to audiences that had grown into the hundreds of thousands. "The difference is," Amara said, "those venture capitalists learned their lesson when I sold my company for over $4 billion. You're about to learn yours right now." She turned back to her phone where Charles Morrison was still on the line waiting. "Charles," she said, "I think it's time we discussed some changes to Aurora Elite's training protocols. Starting immediately, the revelation that Amara Williams owned Aurora Elite Aviation hit the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers sat in stunned silence, their phones capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most documented discrimination incidents in aviation history. Miguel Rodriguez, whose Instagram livestream had grown to over 50,000 viewers, whispered urgently to his camera, "Y'all, this woman just revealed she owns the airline. This pilot just tried to remove the owner from her own plane. This is about to get real." Comments flooded his stream faster than he could read them. "No way, this is insane. That pilot is so fired, share this everywhere, justice in real time, black excellence in action." Lauren Patterson's TikTok Live had exploded to nearly 100,000 viewers, with the video being screen recorded and shared across every major social media platform. Her follower count was climbing in real time as word spread about the unfolding drama. "Beautiful people," she whispered to her phone, "I am literally shaking right now. We just witnessed a black woman get discriminated against on a private jet, and it turns out she owns the airline. This is the most incredible thing I've ever seen." The hashtags were multiplying across platforms. #Aurora, a light owner hash. Justice at a 30,000 feet hash. Pilotgate hash. Amira Williams hash. Black excellence hash. Know who you're talking to. James Brooks, who had been silently observing from seat 2. A stood up slowly. At 44, he'd built his investment banking career by recognizing significant moments when they occurred. This was one of those moments. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "I want to say something." Amara looked at him, curious about what the well-dressed businessman might add to the situation. "I've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes watching this unfold, and I'm ashamed," he continued. "Ashamed that I didn't speak up immediately when I saw what was happening. Ashamed that it took a revelation of your ownership to make people pay attention to clear discrimination." He turned to address Captain Reynolds directly. "Sir, I've been flying private aircraft for 15 years. What I just witnessed was not about medical accommodations or seating logistics. It was about you making assumptions based on appearance, and it was wrong." Miguel immediately turned his camera towards James, recognizing that the moment was expanding beyond a simple confrontation. "That's James Brooks speaking," Miguel said to his audience. "Investment banker, been flying private for years. Even the other passengers are calling this out." Sophia Martinez, who'd been standing frozen in the galley, found her voice. "Miss Williams," she said, stepping forward, "I owe you an apology. When you boarded, I made assumptions too. I questioned your presence here in my mind, if not out loud. That was wrong." Her words carried the weight of genuine remorse. Around the cabin, other passengers began shifting in their seats, recognizing their own complicity in the situation. An elderly woman in seat 4B, Mrs. Eleanor Harper, slowly raised her hand. At 73, she was the widow of a pharmaceutical executive and had seen enough of the world to recognize moral clarity when it presented itself. "Young lady," she said, addressing Amara, "I want you to know that some of us were raised to treat people with dignity regardless of their appearance. What happened here today was disgraceful, and I'm glad you're in a position to do something about it." The show of support was creating a cascade effect. More passengers began speaking up, their voices joining together in a chorus of belated but genuine solidarity. This was discrimination, pure and simple, called out Dr. Rachel Kim from seat 3A. "I recorded the whole thing on my phone," added businessman Tony Valdez. "Happy to share it with whoever needs to see it." Meanwhile, the social media explosion was reaching critical mass. Lauren's original TikTok live stream was being reposted across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story in real time. Breaking news alerts were starting to appear on phones across the cabin. Discrimination on luxury flight owner confronts pilot. Private jet drama goes viral. As black billionaire reveals identity. Captain tries to remove airline owner from her own plane. Senator Thompson, who had been notably quiet since the revelation, finally spoke up. "Miss Williams," he said, his political instincts kicking in, "I want to make it clear that I never requested anyone be removed from their seat. I simply asked about seating options." Amara turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Senator, you're partially correct. You didn't explicitly request that I be removed. But you did express certainty that your needs should take priority over mine, based entirely on your title and your assumptions about my status." She glanced around the cabin, which had become an impromptu courtroom with dozens of witnesses and hundreds of thousands of remote viewers. "This isn't just about Captain Reynolds," she continued, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the aircraft. "This is about a culture that still exists in 2024, where people make instant judgments about who belongs where, based on appearance, age, gender, or race." Miguel's stream was now approaching 200,000 live viewers, with major Instagram accounts beginning to reshare the feed. The viewer comments were coming so fast they were unreadable. "This is history, most powerful moment I've ever seen. She handled this with such grace that pilot's career is over. Black women have to be perfect to get basic respect." Lauren was experiencing the same surge, her follower count jumping from 800,000 to over 1 million as the story spread across platforms. Major news networks were reaching out to her via DM asking for permission to use her footage. "Y'all," she whispered to her camera major, "news networks are contacting me right now. This is about to be everywhere." Captain Reynolds, who had been standing in stunned silence as his world collapsed around him, finally found his voice. "Miss Williams, I made a terrible mistake. I sincerely apologize. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's inexcusable. Captain Amara replied, "Your apology is noted, but apologies don't undo the damage or prevent the next person from experiencing what I just experienced." She lifted her phone where Charles Morrison was still connected and listening to every word. "Charles, are you still there?" "I'm here, Amara. I've been listening to everything." "Good. Because I want our entire passenger manifest to hear what's going to happen next." The cabin fell silent again, even the social media commentators pausing their whispered narration. Effective immediately, Morrison's voice came through the phone speaker. "Captain David Reynolds is suspended pending a full investigation. He will be escorted off this aircraft upon landing and will not fly for Aurora Elite again." Reynolds visibly sagged, the weight of his terminated career settling on his shoulders. Furthermore, Morrison continued, "Aurora Elite will be implementing immediate changes to our training protocols, hiring practices, and customer service standards. This incident will serve as a case study in why assumptions and bias have no place in our industry." "Thank you," Charles Amara said. "I'll want to review those protocols personally before they're implemented." "Of course, Amara. I'm deeply sorry this happened." "I'm not sorry it happened," she replied, surprising everyone listening. "I'm sorry it was necessary, but sometimes the most important lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments." Miguel looked directly into his camera, his voice filled with awe. "Y'all, we just witnessed a masterclass in how to handle discrimination with dignity and power. This woman just changed an entire industry in real time." The comments on his stream were now a constant waterfall of support, outrage, and amazement. "She just made history. Most powerful woman I've ever seen. This is what accountability looks like." The captain chose the wrong passenger to mess with black women or magic. As news of the incident continued to spread across social media, it was clear that what had started as a simple seating dispute had evolved into something much larger, a moment of reckoning that would be studied, discussed, and remembered long after the plane touched down in London. But for Amara Williams, standing in the aisle of her own aircraft, surrounded by witnesses and accountability, it was just Tuesday. Another day of refusing to accept that anyone else could determine where she belonged. The plane was still on the ground, but justice was already taking off. The cabin had transformed from a luxury aircraft into something resembling a modern-day courtroom, with Amara Williams serving as both plaintiff and judge. The live streams had reached over 500,000 combined viewers, with news outlets around the world beginning to pick up the story in real time. Charles Morrison's voice came through the phone speaker with the weight of corporate authority behind it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Charles Morrison, Chairman and CEO of Aurora Elite Aviation. I want to address this incident directly." The passengers sat in rapt attention, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented in aviation history. Miss Amara Williams is not simply a passenger on this flight. She is Aurora Elite's majority shareholder and the chair of our board of directors. She has been instrumental in every major decision this company has made for the past 2 years, including the aircraft you're currently sitting in. Senator Thompson's face had gone pale. He was a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room, and the realization that he'd been secondary to someone he'd dismissed was clearly rattling him. Sophia Martinez approached Amara with a tablet in her trembling hands. "Miss Williams, I pulled up your complete passenger profile. I should have looked more carefully when you boarded." She turned the tablet so everyone could see the screen. The profile showed not just priority boarding status, but detailed notes about Amara's preferences, her role in the company, and explicit instructions that she was to be treated with the utmost care and attention. Priority 1, VIP, board chair owner, Suite 1A. Reserved permanently special notes, prefers minimal fuss, maximum privacy. All requests to be accommodated immediately. Report any issues directly to Chairman Morrison. Miguel Rodriguez, still live streaming to his massive audience zoomed in on the tablet. Y'all, look at this. Her passenger profile literally says she's the board chair. This information was available the entire time. The realization hit like a wave. Every Aurora Elite employee had access to passenger profiles. The information about Amara's status hadn't been hidden or classified, it had been ignored. Captain Reynolds stared at the tablet as if it contained evidence of his own execution. I never checked the detailed profiles. I just saw the seating assignment and assumed. You assumed, Amara repeated the words, hanging heavy in the air. Captain, that's exactly the problem. You looked at me and made a series of judgments based entirely on how I appeared to you. James Brooks stood again, his investment banker instincts recognizing a teachable moment. Miss Williams, if I may ask, how often does this happen to you? The question opened a door Amara had been expecting someone to walk through. Mr. Brooks, it happens more often than you might think even in 2024. Boardrooms, restaurants, first-class lounges, exclusive events. There are still places where people assume I'm either someone's assistant, someone's date, or someone who's lost. Lauren Patterson, whose TikTok Live had become one of the most watched streams in the platform's history, spoke up from her seat. Miss Williams, can I ask you something for my viewers? Amara nodded, recognizing that the social media documentation was actually serving a positive purpose. How do you stay so calm when this happens? Because, honestly, I would have lost it by now. The question resonated with viewers across all the live streams. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination, their admiration for Amara's composure, and their outrage at what they were witnessing. Lauren Amara replied, I stay calm because anger, while justified, rarely changes minds or policies. What changes things is strategic action backed by the power to implement consequences. She gestured around the cabin. Everyone here just learned something important. Captain Reynolds learned it. Senator Thompson learned it. You all learned it. And thanks to your documentation, hundreds of thousands of people watching your streams are learning it too. Dr. Rachel Kim, a passenger who had been quiet until now, raised her hand. Miss Williams, as someone who's experienced similar assumptions in my medical practice, I want to thank you for handling this with such dignity. You've given all of us a masterclass in how to confront discrimination effectively. The comment sparked a wave of similar testimonials from other passengers. Stories began emerging of their own experiences with bias, their recognition of their own assumptions, and their newfound understanding of how casual discrimination operated in elite spaces. Mrs. Eleanor Harper, the elderly pharmaceutical executive's widow, spoke with the clarity of someone who'd lived through decades of social change. In my 73 years, I've seen progress come in many forms. Sometimes it's legislation, sometimes it's protest, sometimes it's education. Today, it's a young woman standing up for dignity with more grace than the situation deserved. Miguel's live stream comments were now a constant cascade of support. She's teaching a whole airplane how to be better humans. This is what leadership looks like. Every CEO should watch this. Black women have been leading with grace forever. That pilot picked the wrong passenger. Meanwhile, news outlets were scrambling to cover the developing story. CNN had interrupted regular programming with a breaking news alert. MSNBC was reaching out to social media users for permission to broadcast their footage. The BBC was preparing a segment for their evening news. The hashtags were trending globally. #Aurora Elite Incident, 2.3 million posts #Amira Williams owner, 1.8 million posts #pilot discrimination, 3.1 million posts #Black Excellence 5, 2 million posts. Charles Morrison's voice returned through the phone speaker. Amara, I want our passengers to understand the immediate steps we're taking. Go ahead, Charles. First, Captain Reynolds is terminated effective immediately. Second, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all Aurora Elite employees within 30 days. Third, we're establishing an anonymous reporting for discrimination incidents. And fourth, we're creating a passenger advocacy board that will include diverse voices to review our policies and procedures. The announcements were met with murmurs of approval from passengers and explosive reactions in the live stream comments. But Amara wasn't finished. Charles, that's a good start, but I want to propose something more comprehensive. She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who had become unwitting participants in a historic moment. I want to create something called the Williams Protocol, not named after me for ego, but for accountability. Every Aurora Elite employee will be trained not just on bias recognition, but on the stories and experiences that led to this protocol's creation. Senator Thompson, who had been notably quiet, finally spoke up. Miss Williams, I feel compelled to say that I support these initiatives completely. What happened here today was unacceptable. Amara looked at him with an expression that was both gracious and pointed. Senator, I appreciate your support now, but I want you to remember this feeling the next time you're in a position to speak up for someone who doesn't have the power to speak for themselves. The comment landed with precision, reminding everyone that true change required action, not just acknowledgement. Sophia Martinez, who had found her voice during the confrontation, stepped forward again. Miss Williams, I want to volunteer for the training development team. I made assumptions today that I'm ashamed of, and I want to help make sure other employees don't make the same mistakes. The offer represented exactly the kind of transformation Amara hoped to inspire, not punishment, but growth. Sophia, I accept your offer. In fact, I think employees who've experienced this learning process firsthand might be our best teachers. As the immediate crisis moved toward resolution, passengers began to realize they'd been witnesses to something that would likely be studied in business schools, discussed in diversity training programs, and referenced in conversations about equality for years to come. Miguel looked into his camera one final time before ending his stream. Y'all, I came on this plane thinking I was going to London for meetings. Instead, I witnessed history. This woman just changed an entire industry by refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. The plane was still on the ground, but everyone aboard understood that when they finally took off, they'd be flying into a different world than the one they'd inhabited when they boarded. As word of the Aurora Elite incident spread across social media platforms, news organizations worldwide scrambled to cover what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant discrimination stories of the year. The combination of live documentation